Welcome to Tactical Talk. This is Zain. Today the topic of our show is India being geopolitically isolated? But before we get to inviting our guest and to our topic, I'd like you to see this beautiful article written by Garrie, which actually describes how India is a divisive force in Asia and is a problem for the SCO and also BRICS. Now let's get back to our topic and also the guest of our show. Today, the guest of our show is Garrie, the director for Your Asia Future and also a senior geopolitical analyst. Welcome to our show, Garrie. This is Zain Khan. It's a pleasure to have you on Tactical Talk.
Well, thanks so much, and I'm very pleased with the positive reaction to the article that you've just shown.
Adam, before getting to the main topic, I'd like to ask you a very simple question. How many neighbors of India have a very unpleasant relationship with India, geopolitically and diplomatically?
The short answer is many. And the long answer is that China and Pakistan, which are India's two biggest neighbors, have historical disputes with India that don't look any closer to being resolved today. And of course, we can get into the details of those disputes later, some of which date from the colonial era and the poorly drawn maps of the borders between India and China drafted by the British. And of course, we have more contemporary disputes, especially the case with Indian-occupied Kashmir. We also see, though, that in the 20th century, India is having problems with places that it typically had decent or even very good relationships with. Bangladesh, which prior to 71 was eastern Pakistan, has traditionally been very close to New Delhi. But now that Bangladesh is warmly embracing the Chinese One Belt, One Road trading initiative, we're seeing friction. We're also seeing friction in respect of Nepal's new leftist government, which also has clearly pro-Beijing leanings. And towards the wider abroad, the near abroad of India, we see issues between India and Sri Lanka, and even more apparently between India and the Maldives.
Adam, let's get to a very important question. The fact that India does not have a good relationship diplomatically, geopolitically, and on all fronts with its neighbors, doesn't this become an obstacle in cooperation initiatives like the SCO?
Absolutely. India and Pakistan both joined the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, last year, and there was a great deal of hope that as joint members of this Pan-Asian and Eurasian security union, security cooperation organization, that there would be hope for some sort of process to resolve the border disputes that India has with China, the trading disputes that India has inaugurated against China, the Indian occupation of Kashmir, and other long-standing disputes with Pakistan. This was clearly the hope, and Russia in particular, as a country, a superpower which uniquely has good relations with China, with India, and with Pakistan, there was a great deal of optimism in Moscow that the membership of both India and Pakistan into this SCO would be productive. That optimism hasn't really been fulfilled lately. We're seeing constant obstructionism from India, a kind of obstinate attitude towards the very important processes of reconciliation, of dialogue, let alone cooperation. So while India digs in its heels, buys more arms from the United States, is increasingly coaxed by the United States, not that Modi's BJP needs much coaxing, into a hostile policy against China in line with the wishes of Washington, and an equally, if not more hostile policy towards Pakistan, along with the wishes of Washington. We're seeing that India is becoming the odd man out in an organization whose goal is to pool collective security throughout the wider Asian space as a means to fight extremism, as a means to make border areas more secure, and as a means to create an Asian mechanism for security that is totally independent of the old colonial masters of the West. Everyone else who's a member of this organization has signed up to those principles, but India, while a member of the organization, doesn't seem to have taken to heart those important phenomena, those important ways of thinking about doing business and security relations. So India, in this sense, is very much the odd man out, and it doesn't look like a great deal of progress is going to be made in the near future.
Okay, Adam, but the question arises, is that what major issues does India face in the SCO due to its policies and those very policies that you've just mentioned?
Well, even though the SCO is technically a security organization, part of the Chinese One Belt, One Road program for integrated trade throughout the wider Asian space and into Africa and Europe is the idea of bringing peace through prosperity. In other words, the nations that trade together will not make war together. Now, unlike Pakistan, which forms an incredibly important, arguably the most important artery of One Belt, One Road in respect of CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which goes from the border between China and Pakistan down to the port at Gwadar in the Gulf of Oman, we see that in respect of trade, India doesn't want to be a part of One Belt, One Road in any way, shape or form. India has threatened to rival China with its own trading blocs, which goes against the spirit of connectivity and peace through prosperity that China has tried to instigate, in which countries like Russia and like Pakistan, and increasingly even countries like Bangladesh, countries like Myanmar, countries far further to the south like Indonesia, have begun embracing. In the Philippines, for example, we see under President Duterte a country that is becoming more and more integrated into an atmosphere of cooperation with China in this realm of peace through prosperity. This has been the case in terms of the Philippines renegotiating its situation in terms of South China Sea claims vis-a-vis Beijing. We now have cooperation and mutual exploitation of resources in the South China Sea between Beijing and Manila. So we have all of these positive developments outside the SCO, but in areas where the SCO is obviously very concerned with preserving the peace and increasing harmonious diplomatic relations. And for India, there's just a total recalcitrant attitude towards trade with its biggest neighbor and the de facto economic superpower of the world, China. We see India not only unwilling to cooperate with Pakistan in terms of building an atmosphere of peace through prosperity, but we see India still surreptitiously funding extremist groups, separatist groups, violent groups in Pakistan, whose goal is to undermine not only the political and territorial unity of Pakistan, but to undermine CPEC. This is frankly disgraceful. China has always left the door open to India for a cooperative strategy that would see all of the major East Asian and South Asian countries cooperate in a unified network. And instead we see India acting to surreptitiously sabotage that network. So this is very, very worrying indeed. On the issue of Kashmir, we see that India is totally unwilling to work in the format of the SCO to reach a peaceful solution to the long occupation of a peoples who have nothing in common with the spirit of Modi's India, who want their independence, who want to exercise their self-determination, who are literally bleeding from a violent military occupation whose only analog in the world today is the Zionist occupation of Palestine. And while the SCO presents a ready-made format to resolve that crisis, we don't see any willingness from New Delhi to use that organization to create a format for peace. And so these are just two of the most strident examples of how India is using its role in a very important international body to simply obstruct the collective progress, both on the economic side and on the security side, that all of the other partners in that body and others want.
Adam, speaking of the SCO, BRICS doesn't really look happy with India either. What's your opinion on that?
We see very similar things that India is doing in the BRICS as what it's doing in the SCO. While the BRICS is a much looser and less formal organization than the SCO, nevertheless there are similar goals. For the BRICS in particular, there's a goal of harmonizing trade between its members and expanding to new members in the so-called BRICS Plus format. Here too we see India unwilling to cooperate. One Belt, One Road is obviously the kind of circle that ties the BRICS together. One Belt, One Road obviously begins in Asia, but it goes into Africa and into Europe. And China, of course, is very interested in expanding trade into Latin America, where it's making many new and important partnerships in that area. So while some point to Brazil as being the outlier in that organization because of recent political instability, the impeachment of the lost president, and the jailing of the president before that, Brazil nevertheless, in spite of its politically turbulent environment, is a committed member of the BRICS because Brazil's leaders, irrespective of their other flaws, let's say, are able to ultimately think pragmatically when it comes to trade. South Africa, while not in the Asian core of the BRICS, is nevertheless a very important partner for all involved, and as China is becoming the most important partner for developing African nations, South Africa, as the leading country in sub-Saharan Africa, is a clearly important member of the BRICS. Things that the BRICS talk about beyond just harmonizing trade are things like creating a BRICS currency or a currency basket, meaning a pooling of several existing currencies. There was also talk at the recent BRICS summit of creating a BRICS-wide cryptocurrency. And this comes as Venezuela has created a national cryptocurrency. Russia looks to do the same with the crypto ruble. And Iran and Turkey have also had discussions about starting their own nationally mined crypto. In all of these areas where we're talking about innovation, where we're talking about progress to break the hegemony of the US dollar and offer partners throughout the developing world alternatives, when we're talking about things like the BRICS Development Bank, India has not been as willing a participant as every other member. And to me, the most worrying thing is that while the BRICS destiny is to expand and to become a kind of unifying collective body for discussions and for innovative initiatives across the developing world, India simply doesn't want the BRICS to expand, while the other members, particularly China and Russia, wanted to expand into this so-called BRICS Plus format. At the last BRICS meeting, we saw countries as far and abroad as Egypt and Mexico participating enthusiastically, while the images alone of Premier Modi were that he was sort of putting his hands in his pockets and being very reluctant to cooperate with other members. So we see India that claims that it's a capital of initiative and of innovation, but that doesn't want to cooperate with others. It's going to lose out itself. This attitude of Modi that India somehow can rival China in terms of security blocks, in terms of trading agreements, in terms of international trading infrastructure, in terms of monetary agreements, it's simply unrealistic. Even for the most ardent nationalistic Indian, it's unreasonable because this kind of narrow-minded nationalism simply doesn't work in an interconnected 21st century. The Chinese model is one that allows this interconnectivity to progress at a rapid rate, all the while making no demands of a nation's internal political situation, of its ideological or cultural situation. It's free of all the strings that are generally attached to agreements with the wider Western alliance led by the United States. And so while Modi has signed up to humiliatingly be the junior partner in a relationship with the United States, he's actively cutting himself off from opportunities in wider developing world organizations like the SCO, like the BRICS. And the only solution isn't necessarily for the SCO or the BRICS to punish India, but simply to expand. And if India wants to be obstructionist, it's going to find that the rest of these organizations will move on. Let's invite in members that are willing participants rather than try to convince India not to do the impossible, which in this case is for Modi to think reasonably. I'm sorry to say, I don't think he's a very reasonable leader in any sense of the word.
Adam, you've mentioned all the issues that India causes in the SCO, how it becomes a divisive factor. But could you also mention what issues it causes in the BRICS? And you've also mentioned that there are a lot of countries who are willing to join the BRICS initiative. Who would you propose on joining the BRICS? Which countries?
Well, in terms of India's obstruction, it's essentially a withdrawal of support for all of the important initiatives like a monetary union, like an agreement on trading in a single currency or a currency basket, a cryptocurrency issued by the BRICS Development Fund. Things like this that India just is obstructing through lack of participation, lack of enthusiasm, and India has even implied very directly that it doesn't want the BRICS to expand, which it absolutely should. And the clear candidates are one, Pakistan, which is already a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which in many respects does have an overlap in terms of the overall agenda between the two organizations. So Pakistan should absolutely be a member of the BRICS. Looking further into Southeast Asia, I think we could see the Philippines become a very productive member of the BRICS. President Duterte has taken the opposite view of someone like Modi. He has embraced multipolarity. He has embraced the win-win goals that have been defined so eloquently by Chinese President Xi. So the Philippines under Duterte would be a sublime candidate for the BRICS. We could see Malaysia, Indonesia. We could see it as a format to create further cooperation between Vietnam and China. Because of all of the Asian countries with disputes with China, we do see more positive signs coming out of Vietnam than we do out of India, so that would also be a clear choice. Then we can look at countries that have already participated in the BRICS Plus. Thailand has observed various BRICS summits. That's a good choice. Egypt, the largest Arab state, is an incredibly good choice. Looking to Latin America, Mexico, which wants to diversify its trading relationships now that the Trump administration has taken such a hostile tone to Mexico. So Mexico and other Latin American countries would be a very good addition to the BRICS. We could see more expansion into Africa. We could see Nigeria. We could see Kenya as just two examples of large African nations that have a very important role to play in international trading organizations and development organizations. So they'd be very crucial members of an expanded BRICS format. And all of these nations I've mentioned have thus far shown that they want to do more for the BRICS than what India has thus far done. And then, of course, we have Turkey and Iran, two Eurasian states that are cooperating more and more with each other, that are both cooperating with Russia, both cooperating with China. Turkey has had historically good relationships with Pakistan. We see that Pakistan and Iran are working towards what I think is an incredibly important rapprochement after decades of mistrust and caution. So I think that Iran, being a more cooperative international country than India in many ways, we could see it benefit from the BRICS, not least because the BRICS could provide Iran investment alternatives in an age where sanctions from the US are coming back and where Europe may well follow the US into those sanctions. So that's the short list, if you will, of countries whose participation in organizations like the BRICS would be much more proactive than obstructionist India.
Adam, let's get to the last question. Since India has been a divisive factor in Asia, how do you see the future of India's diplomatic future within its region?
Well, India has some very important choices it needs to make, and if it doesn't make them by itself, circumstance will make that choice for it. We saw a recent meeting, an informal meeting between Modi and President Xi, to try to reconcile some of the disagreements between India and China. As I thought at the time, and as I wrote at the time, nothing specific has come from this agreement, but what it does show is that at least some people in India are well aware of the CAATSA Act in the United States. This is the major sanctions bill against Russia, against Iran, and against the DPRK. But what many people are coming to realize is that there's a very important clause in this act which authorizes the US to sanction countries who trade with Russia, Iran, or the DPRK. And India, of course, trades with all three. So while India has walked blindly into this lopsided partnership with the United States, India could be in store for a surprise because of much older and more consistent partners of the United States are being threatened with tariffs and sanctions, and this includes the European Union in terms of sanctions to do with the EU's desire to maintain ties with Iran. We see it in terms of tariffs on longtime US allies like Japan and South Korea, and even Canada and Mexico, the United States neighbors. India could be next on that chopping block for sanctions. And if this was the case, India would need to think fast about developing new partnerships with all of the countries that it's been alienating for years now, and which has accelerated under the very reactionary Modi premiership. So India is going to need to ask itself, does it want to cut off all potential future partners in pursuit of this zero-sum game, or does it want to at least keep open the doors that countries like China have held open for India for so long, but thus far to little avail? I'm not entirely optimistic about this, but as I said, circumstance may decide for India before it gets to choose for itself.
Thank you so much, Adam Garrie, for being on Tactical Talk. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
This was Adam Garrie, the director for Your Asia Future. We were discussing, is India being diplomatically, geopolitically, and generally isolated? Until the next episode of Tactical Talk, this is Zain. Take care and goodbye.